Good evening. Welcome to our third online event of this year. We're delighted to welcome Matt Pitts from Plantlife and Philip Hamley from Lethytep to share their Meadows knowledge with us tonight. Just a few things while we wait for people to log on. There's about 800 people who've registered. The talk is being recorded and you will be able to watch it at your own leisure afterwards through the Eventbrite page. We're also running a question and answer session. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of feedback here. Hope that goes in a minute. But we're running a question and answer session at the end, and we'd love you to put your questions into the chat bar, and we can ask Philip and Matt any questions that you have. Now, before handing over to Matt, I'd just like to say that More Meadows is absolutely delighted to be a partner in Plantlife's Meadow Makers, a Green Recovery Challenge Fund project. And over 100 acres of our members' meadows will be restored this year through that project. So I'd like to now introduce Matt. Matt Pitts is Plantlife's Meadows advisor, supporting a wide range of landowners up and down the country. He's a third generation farmer's son, and his career in practical conservation started in his mid-20s with the Kent Countryside Management Service. He then worked for 15 years within the High Weald area of outstanding natural beauty. So, over to you, Matt. I'm very much looking forward to your talk. Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Donna, and it's wonderful to be here as well with everybody. So pleased to be part of this, and so pleased that so many people are hopefully listening in as well tonight. I'm going to share some images with you. So I'm going to talk for probably around 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'm going to pass over to Philip, who's going to kind of share some of his experiences of working on his meadow and doing some restoration there. So I just want to kind of introduce this really and just kind of put some of what I'm going to talk about into a slightly wider context. I suspect most of you are probably familiar with some of the statistics around how many meadows that we've lost over the last 70 or 80 years since the sort of end of the Second World War. I suppose the positive thing is we do still have some left, but yeah, as you can see there, only 3%. So we've lost 97% of our flower-rich or species-rich grasslands across the UK, which is a fairly staggering amount of grassland that's disappeared. And I guess most of that's really as a result of sort of changing farming practice over the last sort of 70 or 80 years. Donna mentioned the Meadow Makers project, so I just wanted to just give you a little bit of information about that. So this is a big project. It's a sort of national project. We're working with 7 or 8 different partners across the UK, and More Meadows is one of those partners. And we've got this really ambitious target to restore over 500 hectares in a year. So we're doing a lot of work. And when I talk about restoration, I guess I'm talking about working on a piece of grass that may not have many species in it and making it more species rich. And I suspect a lot of the grassland that we'll be working with down in Devon is of that situation, rather than ploughing up a piece of grass and converting it in that way. But I'm going to explore this with you a bit more, and I'm going to talk you through, I guess, the basic principles of restoration and the things you might need to think about and consider as you go through a restoration process. So turning a piece of species poor grassland into something that's got more wildflowers in it. So this is just to kind of really hammer it home again, I suppose, in terms of what we consider species rich on the left-hand side there, and typically what a lot of the grassland across the UK looks like, which is agriculturally improved grassland, which has been specifically seeded to have much fewer wildflowers in it, mostly grass and very fast-growing grasses as well, to be much more productive. And then obviously on the left there is what we would call a wildflower meadow, which is typically can have, up to 25, 30 species in a metre, sometimes even more than that, depending on the type of soil that your meadow's on. And again, just to sort of really highlight the differences here. So again, on the left-hand side there, we've got what we would consider a very typical wildflower meadow in the UK. On the right is sometimes what people think a wildflower meadow is. The picture on the right is mainly full of annuals, very brightly coloured. You can see the difference there. And on the left-hand side, much more pastel-y, much more subtle. 90% of the flowers on the left-hand slide are perennials. The ones on the right-hand side are mostly annuals. You can see cornflowers and you can see marigolds in there. But quite often, the one on the right is what people's perception of a meadow is. And of course, most of those are not meadow plants at all. They're plants that would appear around disturbed ground and around the edges of arable fields and the margins of those kind of cornfields. So what we're talking about today is definitely on the left. It's that species-rich native wildflowers that are mostly perennials that we're trying to restore into these meadows. So, I mean, when we're working with people and trying to help them to create new meadows or restore existing areas of species poor grassland, probably one of the most important things that we think about is trying to get a really good understanding about what's there already. The soil is clearly really critical. Something about the history as well, understanding the history of the land use as well and how it's been used, whether it's been intensively used, whether it's been improved in some way agriculturally. Trying to get an understanding about what plants are already growing there, because you'll be surprised that lots of pieces of grassland sometimes have been grassland for long periods of time, 20, 30, 40 years. And typically, because they've been managed agriculturally, you may not be aware that there may already be quite a lot of wildflowers in there. So trying to get a bit of a handle on how many existing flowers already in a meadow is a really important part of the decision-making process when we start to work with somebody to do a restoration. So all of those things kind of help to build a picture really and help to give us better understanding so we can make the right decisions really when we come to talk about the restoration and the process that somebody would go through. So I'm just going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So soil, as I said, is a really sort of fundamental building block, as you can imagine. Anyone who sort of thinks about gardening, the type of soil has a bearing on what will grow best in any given situation. And of course, meadows are absolutely no different. So understanding some of the kind of chemical properties of the soil and the type of soil you've got really is a sort of important first step in terms of what we might advise. Just like in a garden context, there are certain plants that will do very well on very acidic soil, and there are other plants that will do very well on more alkaline soil. So having a basic soil test, which is something that's quite easy, and most people can just go around and collect a soil sample and have that soil sent away to a lab. You can get that information, so you can get the pH. You know, and a lot of people will do this in the garden if they're trying to grow particular plants. They, you know, an understanding of the soil pH is really important. So on the bottom of the slide there, I've got a couple of specialist plants on the left-hand side. That's a lousewort, and that's typically found on very, very acidic soils in a grassland, in a wildflower meadow. And on the left there, a horseshoe vetch, which is again much more typical of alkaline soils. And in the middle, quite a lot of our soils across the country do sort of fall into that middle range, with sort of in the neutral or just off neutral. And there are a whole load of quite generalist wildflowers that will grow in more neutral soils. And then at the extreme ends, there are some of these more specialist plants that will only do very well in acid or very well in alkaline. So it's a useful to understand your soil, because that can help to, well, you want to be trying to plant the right species for the right kind of soil, and also ones that are going to thrive on that particular soil type. So, and again, whether it's wet or sandy or clay, all of those things have a bearing as well on the pH. So that's a really important consideration, understanding something about the soil pH. There's information online actually where you can find out a little bit more about soil. So there's quite a lot of free information available actually that you can kind of dig into if you have a piece of land. One place that we would often go just to get a bit of a sense, and this is particularly but before we might go and visit a landowner, is to look on the Soilscapes website, which is freely available website, and it's a map, and you can put in your postcode and then you can move around the map, and it brings up sort of some generalized information about the soil type in your particular area. So if you've got a field and you want to try and find out a little bit more about the soil type, it's a good place to start looking. But going back to taking soil tests, so the pH is really important. So where it sits within that scale. The other aspect of soil as well is understanding a little bit about the fertility of the soil. Wildflowers tend to grow better on sites or on land that is fairly low in fertility. Typically, agricultural land will have been improved in fertility because they're trying to maximize the production of that land. And one of the most important things that we would look at in terms of understanding the soil chemistry and looking at the different soil nutrients is to understand the phosphorus that's in the soil. It's a plant nutrient, and it's typically added as an artificial fertilizer onto agricultural land. So again, understanding a little bit about the history of that land will maybe give you an indication as to whether this particular nutrient has been added to your land or not. So if you send your soil away to have it sampled and tested in a specialist lab, they will typically send you back a printout of all of the kind of soil nutrients for your piece of land. And when we're looking at that piece of information, that's a really useful piece of information to help us to make the right decisions about what is possible and not possible. We would look at what's called the phosphorus index of the soil, and that basically is a measure of how much phosphorus is still actually in that soil. And what we're looking for when we're starting a restoration or a creation of a wildflower meadow is the lowest possible, ideally. So there on the table there, you've just kind of got a range. So typically, if your soil test comes back around 3 or below, that's generally a reasonably good starting point, and you would be reasonably confident if we can get the management right and we can find the seed that's a good starting point for a restoration or a creation of a new meadow. If the phosphorus is much higher than that would typically indicate that land has had a lot of agricultural improvement. And the challenging thing about phosphorus is it's only taken up in very small amounts by wild plants and by grass. So it takes a long time for it to be removed from the soil. So the higher that value, the longer it will take to disappear, and therefore the more challenging it might be to get large numbers of wildflowers established. So that's why we kind of want to understand about the soil. So, I mean, management as well previous management is a really important consideration as well. Understanding, has the site been managed very much in recent years? Has it been left and has it been grazed? Has it been made from hay? So all of these things, again, we can start to I sort of think of it as a bit like a wildflower detective. You can sort of go around and you can start to look at the plants and look at what's going on in that field, and that can start to give you a lot of clues really about past management. Looking at the species that may be present can obviously help you to understand the soil type as well. So clearly a site like this hasn't been managed for a long period of time. You can start to see in the background there, we've got trees growing in amongst those brambles. So we know that it hasn't been cut for many years. You can also see those big lumps, which are possibly ant hills or maybe mole hills that have been there for a long period of time. So we know that machinery hasn't come into this field for a long time as well. So all of these kind of little clues can kind of help you to kind of think about what might be the suitable route through to a restoration in a field like this. So all of these things kind of help to build a picture really of what's going on in the meadow. Again, this is just looking at a meadow that might be a possible meadow for restoration. And again, I'm sort of looking at the plants here. I suspect some of you probably can recognise, even though it's not a great picture, there's quite a lot of docks there. It's just a common plant in the countryside and particularly in meadows. And again, that might well tell us about how a piece of land has been managed. Often when you get huge numbers of docks or thistles or maybe nettles, that may tell us that the soil is either quite fertile. It might also tell us that there's been quite a lot of disturbance in that ground at some point. It may also tell us that the land hasn't been always so well looked after, and maybe it's been grazed at the wrong time of year and livestock have been in there when it's been too wet and the ground has got very disturbed. So again, all of these things are giving us a bit of a clue, but they're also a little bit of a red flag. So if you see lots of things like thistles or docks, they're plants that are quite invasive. They spread very rapidly. They spread from seed very easily. And the process of doing a restoration, we are going to have to create some bare ground. And of course, if we've got problem plants like these in there already, that process of creating bare ground potentially can actually cause more of a problem. So we need to understand a bit about some of these problem plants in that assessment as well before we start to go down a route of restoring or creating a new meadow. So really that sort of comes back to trying to understand what's already in the meadow that you're going to be working on. I would suspect that most people who have already got a piece of grass or a field, it's already grass. It's not that common to be starting completely from a blank canvas and from a ploughed field, particularly in your part of the world. So most people have probably already got a field with some grass in it. And they may well already have some wildflowers in it. And what's typical is that field has probably been grazed for a lot of the year. So you don't know, because you never let those plants are never allowed to grow, flower through a whole season. So often we might just say to somebody, if you could just stop doing anything to that meadow for a whole season, so that we can then come back and look at that field in the middle of the summer and get a better sense as to what's in there and see whether there are many wildflowers in that meadow already. So that's a really important consideration in this process of going through a creation or a restoration into wildflower meadows. So again, we're looking at the plants that might be problems. So we're looking for those problem plants. So, the docks that I mentioned earlier, we're also looking for other things like thistles, which again can be problematic if you're trying to do this restoration, go through this restoration process, and how many of those there are. And if the field is very much full of those, that's something that would need to be dealt with before you start going down a restoration. But we're also looking for some of the nice plants that might have survived, because quite lots of bits of grassland, particularly in the southwest, are what we would probably say were probably old pasture, and sometimes they may well have survivals of some of these more typical wildflower meadow plants in there. So again, looking for those can help us to understand, and also that can help us to make the best plans going forward in terms of the restoration. So, typical wildflower plants you might find in your part of the world are yellow rattle, which is a really common plant, particularly in hay meadows, and very high quality hay meadows tend to have lots of yellow rattle in them. And again, bird's foot trefoil, again, is quite a common plant. I suspect many of you have seen that in meadows. And again, that will often persist in meadows, even if they're quite heavily managed over quite a long period of time. So you may find that you've got a little clump here and there of some of these species. Another one here as well, so a few more plants that are worth kind of looking out for. So everything on the left-hand side are the nice plants. The ones that you would be looking out for are what we would call positive indicators of a wildflower meadow, or somewhere that has good potential. So if you find any red clover in your meadow already before you start a restoration, that's generally a good sign. Again, another plant that's often quite common and will also persist even through quite intensive agricultural management is the common knapweed there as well. So you might just find the odd one of these plants. Sometimes you find them right on the periphery of the meadow as well, sometimes where the more intensive agricultural activity hasn't happened. So the plants on the left-hand side there, so I've got white clover is a very typical plant that's introduced to try and make meadows more productive agriculturally. And again, the perennial ryegrass. And often meadows were actually overseeded in the past with these species to try and make them more agriculturally productive. So you might find some of those plants in amongst some of the older, the more typical wildflower meadow plants. But if you're finding that your meadow's got huge quantities of white clover and huge quantities of that perennial ryegrass, again, that will send us down a slightly different path, because that would suggest that field has been agriculturally improved at some point in the more recent past, and that may be more challenging to get a restoration going on. But it's not impossible. It just takes us down a slightly different path. And all of these plants, typically the best time to try and identify some of these wildflowers is in the season when they're going to be flowering. So that's typically probably from the end of May, certainly through June and through July and into early August, so you'll start to see a lot of these plants over that time. And it's a lot easier to identify wildflowers when they're in flower than try and identify them purely from the leaves. So we would generally always encourage people to, and even ourselves when we're coming around and doing surveys, it's a lot easier to do that kind of work in the summer, just because we can get a much better picture about what's going on in the meadow and what already exists there. So we've gone through that process and we've decided that a meadow has got potential. It hasn't got too many problem weeds in it, which would always be a barrier to doing something. And if there are too many, we would have to control those first. And you might end up using some sort of either mechanical or possibly a chemical spot spraying type treatment to control some of those perennial weeds. But we've kind of made that decision. We've looked at the meadow. I'm talking hypothetically here, clearly. So we've decided it hasn't got too many weeds. We've decided also that it maybe has got a few of those wildflowers that I've listed there. So that would be, and we've also done our soil test, so we understand what the soil is like. We also understand what the fertility is like, and we've decided from our soil test that the fertility is low enough. So it's within that range of the index of 3 or below. So that's a really good starting point. So that, that's what we're kind of looking for. That's an ideal scenario. A few wildflowers, not too many of those modern grasses, not too many of those problem weeds, and a fairly low fertility. The pH doesn't matter so much because we can tailor the wildflowers depending on what the pH is telling us. But typically, quite a lot of the meadows on the edges of well, certainly off Dartmoor, are kind of sort of neutral or just off neutral and slightly acidic. So, and they get more acidic as you get further down. So that's fine. So we've decided that our site is suitable. And then the next challenge, I guess, if you want to use that word, or the next interesting thing is to then try and find out what we're going to do. And Plantlife generally will advocate the idea of what we would call natural seeding. And that is trying to find an existing meadow in the locality of your meadow that you're trying to create or restore, and using the seed from that existing meadow. So we're trying to look for a fairly species-rich meadow somewhere locally to you that has the typical wildflower species that would grow in your area and is on the same type of soil, ideally, because we're trying to replicate what we know grows well there and what will grow best on that soil type. So there's a bit of, again, a bit more detective work to be done to try and find a suitable, what we would call a donor meadow. And again, there are different places that you can go. I mean, you're lucky that you've got the More Meadows group, and you've got lots of people with meadows, and lots of people know quite a lot about their meadows. And there are people in amongst the group that have already got meadows that have got lots of wildflowers. So there's lots of people that you can speak to and find out about. Not everybody's quite so lucky; they don't have a group of people that are all kind of collectively working on meadows. But one place that you can go and try and find out about what's going on in the landscape and what might be nice meadows nearby to where you live is a website called Magic, and it's a government website, and it's a DEFRA run website, and it has information about different habitats across the UK. This is just a quick screenshot, and what I've done is gone onto the website. I've put in my postcode, and then I can go down on the left hand side and I can turn on and off different things. I've gone into the habitats and species information, and I can turn on what we would call priority habitat. So the priority habitat inventory of the UK identifies bits of land that are already good quality habitat typically. So we can go into that, and then we can drill down again, and we can switch on grassland. So that the map there you're seeing is basically showing areas of what should be, not always, but typically would be quite species rich grassland. So that's a good starting point. And again, you're not necessarily going to know who it belongs to, but I suspect, living somewhere locally, you may be able to find out. And it's a question of asking around and just kind of piecing together. But this is often a starting point that we will use in terms of trying to look around the locality of a meadow to try and find out whether there's somewhere suitable to use as a donor site. And Philip's going to talk a little bit more about his meadows later, but his site has been used as a donor site, and I think maybe even one of the More Meadows members has used Philip's site. But his site was used last year on some restorations down on the Duchy estate, just into Cornwall, because he's already got a species-rich wildflower meadow, which is ideal for using as a donor, so we can move all that material. So the process of doing this idea of natural seeding, so it's finding that meadow, it's using, it's collecting the seed in some way, and there are different approaches to doing this. I've just got a slide here which kind of shows several approaches. One approach that's become really popular now is on the bottom right-hand side there. You've got the chap on the quad bike. He is dragging along a specialist piece of equipment. It's called a seed harvester, and it's basically like a sort of road sweeper, which just is set slightly high in the field. And he's in that wildflower meadow there, and he was in there I think at the beginning of August, and the brush just kind of sweeps across all of the wildflowers. And the picture above on the top right is the result of that sweeping. So what you end up with is a bit of grass, as you can see, and you end up with lots of little bits of flower, but everything that's gone to seed within that meadow also gets brushed into the back of that machine, and then it gets sieved. And typically that would then get dried out on those large tarps, normally inside a building, so it doesn't all get blown away. And then that can be used as a seed mix, which can be spread on the site that you've already prepared, ready to sow. So that's the process. So that's one particular method of doing it. Down in the bottom left-hand side there, that is actually Philip's meadow from last year. So the contractor baled he cut the grass, and it was baled the following day, so it's still green. So in that process, he's actually transferring some of the seed is still on that material, and it's getting wrapped into that bale, and then those bales are getting taken to the field, and they're going to get spread on the field. So those are all different methods. So in the top left hand side there, you can use, I mean, that's basically a leaf blower. Most leaf blowers have the ability to be reversed, so they can act like a hoover. So if you're just talking about trying to get small quantities of seed, or you're just trying to go and target a particular species in a meadow, one of those is really good. You can just literally put it on the top of the plants, and you'll suck up other bits and pieces too. But in effect, you're doing the same process as the brush harvester, but just that you can be a bit more targeted with that. The step I haven't talked about is the preparation of a meadow. So before you sow seed or spread green hay on it, there's a process you need to go through to prepare your meadow. Typically, you would have made sure the grass was very, very short before you do what you can see on the screen there. But what we do need to do, if we're going to introduce seed, or we're going to introduce green hay, and of course the seed will drop out of that green hay, that seed needs to make contact with soil. A lot of people make this mistake. They've got a grassy patch, and they just buy a packet of seeds, and they just kind of sprinkle it over the grassy patch. They've done no preparation at all. And then a couple of years later, they phone up Plantlife and they say, I tried to create a meadow and it didn't work. And we have a conversation and we ask them what they did, and they say, well, I sprinkled the wildflowers in my grass and nothing happened. And generally the reason sometimes the seed may be old, and some of the wildflower seeds don't last for very long. They're not viable for that long. So, but typically what happens is they haven't created any disturbance. They haven't made any bare ground in their grassy area. So we've got a range of different machines on the screen there that will all create bare ground. They all work best when the grass is already very short. So typically we would be doing this work, this restoration, this introducing of seed or broadcasting of seed is normally done probably from late July, August or September, depending on what process you're going to do and how you collect the seed, whether it's green hay or whether it's the seed. So you need to have the grass very short, and that typically could have been hay cut, or it may have just been grazed very, very short. And then one of these machines generally will work pretty well at creating some bare ground. So on the left-hand side, top left there, that's what we would call a power harrow. So, good, very good for creating bare ground. But again, it can sometimes create too much bare ground if the machine is set too deep. So there are ways of making the machine go very, very shallow so you don't create too much disturbance. And then on the top left, we've got what we would call a flail collector. So that cuts the grass, but you can see there that it also scalps the soil slightly. It's got big sort of blades that spin around. And of course, in the process of cutting and collecting and being set very low, it also creates bare ground at the same time. So that's a really good machine for creating some bare ground to broadcast seed onto or to spread green hay onto. Down in the bottom left, that's a chain harrow, typically often used in this context. But as you can see there, it doesn't actually create as much bare ground as you might think. It's kind of pulling out some of the old dead and dying grass. And typically you might need to run over your meadow several times before you create enough bare ground for that seed that you're going to spread to make contact. The bottom right is what we would call a tine harrow, and that's sat on the back of the tractor, a bit like those springy rakes that you use in the garden for raking the moss out. It's a bigger version of that, and that's really good at kind of pulling out all the old thatch and creating bare ground. So the two right-hand side machines are probably the best, and the power harrow, if it's done right, can work really well. And probably the least effective out of those four machines is the chain harrow in the bottom there, bottom left. So in terms of actually then getting that seed onto your prepared ground, If it's green hay, it could be spread by hand by somebody literally just throwing it out off the back of a trailer, like there. On a larger scale, typically it might be put into a back of a muck spreader if you're working on a farm scale or a field scale. The bales that were used last year from Philip's land were put into a straw chopper, which you can see that on the top right hand side there, and that's a machine that's designed to chop bales, particularly round bales, and then it blows it out, and that was basically spreading that material, that green hay, along with the seed across the prepared field. In the middle there, we've got that's a slug pelleter, and of course you could put seed into a slug pelleter, and that could be easily broadcast across the field. When we're broadcasting seed, we're not burying it, we're just putting it straight on the surface. And obviously, if you're working on a much smaller scale, you can literally just hand spread the seed out, just broadcast it out, literally from a bucket. And typically, if we're doing it on that scale, we tend to mix the seed with something like sand, just A, so that it stops it all blowing away, and B, it makes it easier to see where you've sown. It just kind of makes it a little bit easier to work with, and it makes the spreading a bit more even. So once we've done the seed broadcasting onto that pre-prepared bare short ground, the most critical sort of next step is the initial management afterwards. And typically, we would advise that the ground or the grass is kept very short. So some of that seed is going to germinate in the autumn, some the following spring. So keeping the grass suppressed over the autumn and into the winter and into the very early spring of this very, very first year of the restoration is really, really important. And ideally, I mean, you can see there, livestock are perfect for doing this. If you don't have livestock, it is potentially possible to come in and cut the grass. And it depends on how quickly the grass is growing in your field. But the worst thing for a restoration is for the grass to suddenly grow back very, very lush. And of course, then it just completely smothers or it shades out all of these tiny little seedlings that are growing. So the management afterwards is really, really important. And then so after that initial year, that autumn, winter, hopefully we'll have some seeds germinating, and some of those seeds will then flower the following year. And then once we've got that field with some of those wildflowers established, quite a lot of those will be perennials, so they may not flower in the first year. They may take a year or two to get going. Some of them will be annuals and may well flower. Things like yellow rattle typically may flower in the first year because that's an annual. And then typically we would then revert to a sort of traditional hay meadow management style of management to maintain that meadow and to help those wildflowers to get better established and spread right through the field. I've just got a very, very brief sort of, this is kind of the hay meadow year. I'm really there. So for quite a large chunk of the year in this sort of traditional hay meadow management, that the field isn't happening at all. You know, so from probably end of February, the field will be left ungrazed and completely closed off from anything. And of course, that's the time when those wildflowers get growing, and then they're left to flower through to typically mid-July or early August. Then you would take a hay cut. And then you would graze through the late summer and through the autumn and into the early winter, and that process just repeats and repeats and repeats. And it's that long-term commitment to management that tends to make this whole process work, and those flower meadows become as rich as some of these amazing ones that we still have. You know, those 3% that still exist in the landscape today. And also the other aspect of this, if you can't make hay and you don't have the facility, or you're not able to manage your wildflower meadow as a hay meadow, it's still possible to manage it as a pasture. So the hay cutting isn't happening, but typically you still need to do some removal of the material that's grown in the year. And typically in an agricultural system, in a traditional system, that would be through livestock grazing, and that would be livestock grazing through the late summer and early winter. So again, there's nothing much going on in the meadow in the spring and summer, at least the early summer, when those flowers are getting established and flowering and finishing flowering. It's from the late summer onwards that the grazing happens, and that's again trying to remove that material that's grown that year. And that cycle repeats and repeats again, and that obviously is a way of maintaining wild. So both of those options are potential ways of maintaining wildflower meadows. And typically, that all sounds pretty straightforward. Sometimes there are challenges. We sort of mentioned some of the problem weeds, and it's something to be aware of. And even once a meadow is established, you can still have problems with weeds. And there are different ways, I guess, of controlling weeds. And it depends on the kind of, I'm saying weed is probably not the right term. The plant we want the plant we don't want that's in the wrong place, because all plants are valuable. It's just sometimes that we don't want them in that particular location. So, I mean, one way of controlling weeds in an existing meadow where you've started a wildflower restoration is spot spraying there. So you're literally targeting the individual weed itself. And again, manual removal of these problem plants can be done as well. Depending on how many you've got, it's actually quite a rapid process using, that's called a lazy dog, that tool that's on the right-hand side. So it's just a bit of a specialist kind of spade, I guess, but it's designed for pulling out some of these deep-rooted problem plants that we might not want in a meadow. And again, the way you manage your meadow as well. So if you're overgrazing during the winter and it's very wet, that can cause more problems. So thinking about the way you manage your meadow has a bearing on how successful the restoration will be, but also how much of a problem you might find with some of these other problem plants later on down the line. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour of the process that we would go through in terms of helping somebody to either restore or create a new meadow. I'm going to hand you over to Philip now, and he's going to talk about the meadows that he has and has worked on. He'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's probably, he's been there for nearly 30 years. Are you there, Philip?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So I'm going to hand over to you, Philip, and if you'll just give an introduction to yourself and a bit about what you've done on your meadows, that'd be lovely.
Oh, well, thank you, Matt. And first of all, everyone, thank you for asking me to come and speak to you tonight. I feel quite privileged. I have to start off by declaring that I'm not an expert in any way on plants or anything like that, but I've wanted to do it badly enough to find out those things. And it turns out that actually you get to a stage where you think, well, this is so easy. Why doesn't everyone do it? It's so easy. But it can be confusing. My background was not in farming, but I was fortunate that due to my great interest in farming, I was able to purchase some land on over a few years, and I got up to 52 acres here about 40 years ago. And I found that traditionally, or no, as modern farming does. So I had cattle and sheep, and I used to put a very small amount of fertilizer on, artificial fertilizer, because I suppose I was indoctrinated in modern farming practices, because that's all you hear about these days, sprays and fertilizers, etc. But then about 20 years ago, I decided that perhaps I wasn't doing the right thing. I was always frustrated by the neighbours going into their silage fields and taking away huge trailer loads of it. And as the last trailer load went out of the gate, another tractor came in with a manure spinner on it. And this would happen 3 or 4 times in a year, in a season, you know. And I just kept thinking, this cannot be right. How can this be right? We're take. And I understand that they're putting something back in the way of nutrients, but particularly it's only for the grass. And modern grasses have been mucked around with, I'll say, or made to produce much heavier crops, etc. And that's been the sole goal. How much silage can we make? Because the more silage we have, the more cattle, the more cows, whatever. I want to pick up before that and go back to what I think is the most important, the basic roots of all this. I know we say wildflower meadows, but wildflower meadows actually is not necessarily a misnomer, but traditionally they were called hay meadows. And why did everyone have hay meadows? Because exactly the same as today, they had to feed their stock during the winter. But of course, without the machinery that we've got these days, the quantities were relatively small, and the farms themselves were small. 50 acres was a big farm years ago. But due to the labour, it was often the labour that the ladies that used to have to go and pick up the hay and then load it onto the trailers and take it in and put it in the mow. and then pick it out again to feed for the livestock during the winter. But if you think now you've got lots of labour involved in this, and it's all brought in with a horse and wagon, so you choose a field to cut the hay in. I mean, this has been going on over hundreds of years. It's not just something that happened. They adopted the practices that made life simple for themselves. And to make it simple for themselves, it's so silly to go and cut a field of hay when it was half a mile up the road and in and out of 4 or 5 gates, etc., because of the distance from the farm itself where it would be ultimately fed. So it was natural that they would choose a field that was very close to the homestead. And that field literally became permanently their hay field. They would cut the same field for hay every year. And now, of course, the way they managed it by cutting it the same and then taking all away in August, September, July, whenever the weather allowed, it was this process that encouraged the flowers that we now focus on. So we've come to the term wildflower meadow. But back at the time, talking 70, 100 years ago, they didn't grow it for the flowers. It was simply a byproduct of what they were trying to do to feed their cattle. They had to do it. They couldn't afford the luxury of just going out to have a walk around and enjoy the flowers. So they always used the same meadow. And of course, that's how now it was particularly suitable for the wildflowers to prosper. And that's what they did. And they did the same thing year after year after year. And this is what I try to tell people, that they must understand. You can't make a hay meadow to keep to the doctrine. You have to unstock the field early in the season. Perhaps it depends. At the end of each season, after the hay had been taken in, there was always a resurgence of grass, as there is now in August, September, October. If we get a mild time and wet, we get masses of grass. Now, back at the time, they've still got their cattle and sheep to feed, so they would put them in those fields to graze, and nothing had to go to waste. They couldn't have the niceties of simply keeping them in there for a week and then putting them in another meadow. No, they grazed them, and grazed them hard, because if you had cattle and it turned really wet, and you get to November, December, you had to take the cattle out. It would simply poach the ground. So they had to eat the grass out, and of course there was no point in leaving grass in the meadow to spoil. So they would be starting the year in February, March with a field of very short grass, which is just what Matt has been explaining to you now. It has to be taken away in the winter as well, by one way or another. Either it's taken away with machinery or stock. Now, I've always used sheep. They're very convenient, and you don't get the same problem with poaching in the fields. But if you're doing a smaller project, it could well be that you've got a lawnmower with some sort of collector on it, which you can then cut this grass again and pick it up. And as long as you take it away and make a heap somewhere, then you're creating the same process. And then, of course, in the spring, the grass will grow again, and this is a really important point as well. They will have had the benefit of all the cattle or sheep's dung in the latter part of the previous year. Now, that is Mother Nature's gift, because very much undervalued. We've lots of bigger farms now turned to slurry. I'm sorry, I'm not a fan of slurry at all. But old-fashioned cattle dung is the most wonderful thing that I was going to say you can't buy. You can, I know, but in small quantities. So that was wonderful. And then the next spring, everything would get going. The whole process starts again. And it's just, the important thing is to keep this process going year after year. I didn't know anything, really. I'd farmed for nearly 50 years. I've had no training or got no letters after my name. But about 20, 25 years ago, as I said, I started, I just as well tell you, I was getting older as well. And there comes a time in life when you do start to think about more things deeply. And I think this is probably what started me off. And then I had a dear friend of mine who came and looked around. He was a butterfly fanatic. And he said to me, Philip, you've got a lovely little place down at the bottom of that field over there. He said it would be perfect for butterflies if you could encourage some. So I got a few wildflower seeds at the time and just chucked around as a trial, about half an acre, I suppose, that's all. I cut it down with my grass mower, lawnmower. And of course, you know the next bit. I had wildflowers and it prospered, and then I thought, well, I'm going to do a bit more. And so it went. And I ended up that I've done now 40 acres. The rest is grassland and lakes and woodland, etc. But it's 40 acres of hay meadows now. Going back to farmers and farming again, I really do think, and I hope we've got some farmers aboard tonight, because if I can only do one thing by talking to you, it's please to encourage you to do this for wildlife now. There's so much going on at the moment, and it really needs to happen, and you're the people that can do it. I've got 5 or 6 farmers now who are changing over their land to wildflower meadows. I don't expect any farmer to change their lot. I don't mean no one's going to be doing that, but a proportion. And I've got farmers with literally 50, 60 acres now that they're converting. And it's very humbling to see them. They're really keen. And I was going to go back. I've got all my bits and pieces here written down, but I'm going back into, yes, no, that was something else. I should have diverted when I said dung. Another main thing, cattle. I used to keep the cattle. I used to worm them, etc., with the injections from the vet. But as time went on and I decided I was doing differently, I kept less cattle. Therefore, they weren't so thick on the ground. And then we had this news about the injections they give them for worming cattle, this is, to worm their cattle. And it turns out, of course, that gets passed through the cattle's gut system, and ends up in the dung. And when they deposit that kills all the dung beetles, etc. And all these things have been happening for years, and we really just haven't noticed it, or perhaps have noticed it but thought, well, I can't do anything about that. But I'm sure you can. I believe that the farming community has had a severe disconnect with nature over the last 50 or 60 years. It's after the war, of course, when pesticides were first introduced and artificial fertilizers. And farmers these days, some of them, especially the younger generations, look, I've had nearly 3 generations now who've been fixated with putting on manures and sprays, and wildlife has paid the price. It's improving somewhat, It really is, but it needs more focus from the government, which I'm hoping that we're going to get at the moment. It does sound as if we may anyway. But and the other thing, of course, is that when we don't put on the fertilizer now, and we have the plants, I'm going to refer specifically to plantain, ribwort plantain, which isn't very attractive floristically, but it's a wonderful thing for cattle and sheep. Now, no one ever asks the cattle or sheep which field they'd like to go into today, which one has got the sweetest grass, where are going to prosper best. They simply think, well, we'll put them in that field. That's got the most grass in there. What they mean is the most ryegrass, because they've had some manure on it and it's really grown well. And at the same time, of course, they introduce these feeding blocks that contain lots and lots of minerals to their sheep and cattle in the fields. And no one's told them that actually Mother Nature provides all these things free of charge. You don't have to go to Mole Valley Farmers or anyone else to get these minerals. Mother Nature will provide that. And I can always illustrate this wonderfully to the man that brings some sheep here for me. Because about 5 years ago, he said to me, Philip, every time I bring sheep to you in the winter, I always bring some mineral blocks. But he said, do you know they never touch them when they come here? And of course I had to smile, and I said, well, you know why that is, don't you? Because the modern grasses that you've got, etc., aren't deep-rooted. They don't do that. But what I've got here, and ribwort plantain, classic example amongst many, is very deep-rooted. And it goes down and brings the minerals up. And the sheep and cattle know this. They know what's good for them. Ask any farmer. You've got a tree that's blown down in the field, and it's covered in ivy. And if you've got cattle and sheep in there, they'll be all over it until they clear the blooming lot. They know what's good for them, but no one asks them. I'm sounding a bit a downer. It's not supposed to be a downer on farming community. I have wonderful friends in the farming community, and lots and lots of interest. That wasn't the only thing that I was going to tell you about that. The other thing, of course, is with sheep in particular. I can speak more broadly about sheep now because I've been having sheep here for about 25 years. And there's another bonus to having sheep and ribwort plantain, amongst other wildflowers and grasses, is that ribwort plantain acts on the sheep as an anthelmintic. In other words, it destroys the worms. Now, you always know when your sheep have heavy infestation of worms because, well, putting it quite bluntly, their backsides are always dirty. And then they have to bring them in and tail them and clean them up for lambing, etc., etc. But as your numbers, if you keep your numbers down, you don't get the same problem because the sheep are spread more thinly over the field. They don't pick up the worms. So I know that when they bring sheep and I open the gate for the sheep and let them into the field, doesn't matter what grass or clover or anything else I've got in the field, it's heads down for the ribwort plantain. And they stay with their heads down until they've stripped the field of it. But then, as I told him just a month ago when he came and took the sheep, I said, your sheep were clean when they came here. He said, so I said, look at them now. They're just as clean now as when you brought them. And that's 5 months later. So that's another good reason that we've forgotten about, or farming has forgotten about. I think we need to go back and start again somewhat. I was lucky to get a HLS agreement on all my land. I told you about the chap that recommended I do a patch to start with, which I did, and then it just went on from there and there. And my meadows developed wonderfully. But after 5 or 6 years, I was amazed for the first time. I've never seen them here on the farm before, but I had some orchids come up, just 3 or 4, and it was Southern Marsh, which are very, very prominent. I was absolutely delighted. I couldn't believe where they came from because it was in a wet, dirty patch of previous woodland. I just don't know where they came from. But the following year there were 10, and the following year there were 30, and then 100, and then 300, and now they're in their thousands every year. And that's because I've done nothing. That's Mother Nature now working at her best. So lots and lots of people come here to see the orchids in the spring. I've got 5 different orchids arrived on site now. Not in such prolific numbers as the Southern Marsh, but they're a wonderful sight in early June. The green hay side of it was something that I started in a very small way back about 10 years ago. I had people come here looking around who were interested in what I was doing. And they asked if they could take some seeds from the hay, and we used to cut it by hand or whatever, or with a machine, and they take it home and come back. And of course, that's developed now to it's not getting out of hand. But I'm selling so much green hay that I'm going to have to put the brakes on at some point. But I'm working with the Duchy of Cornwall again this year. Because Prince Charles has decided that he would like to see a hay meadow on each one of his tenant farmers' holding. So they're trying to source the seed, and I did some last year for them, and they've come back for a heck of a lot more this year. So I'm really, really pleased about that. About 9-10 years ago, when we were really getting going, my neighbours said to me, "Philip, why don't you open up your grounds so that people can come in here and have a look around, etc. And perhaps we could make some money for charity at the same time." So I said, that would be a great idea. They've been very good neighbours, and they've helped. And they've got a little pond of their own as well, and walk around there. So for the last 10 years, we've done some open days here at Lethytep for charity, and we've taken individual small groups in between those open days as well. And at the end of, we can't count this last year, 2020, can we? Because we had very, very few people here, I'm afraid, until the end of the year. But during that previous 9 years, we raised £80,000 for charity, local medical charities, always local, cancer research and all those sorts of medical things. So we're really proud of that. And then everyone used to say to me, "Philip, do you get any help with all this?" Because I'll tell you now, it is a lot of work. And as you'll have probably guessed by now, I'm not in my first flush of youth. So they said, "Do you get any help, financial help?" And I said, "Well, no, I get the basic payment scheme for farming. But there are other schemes, which I expect a lot of you will know about, which was called higher level stewardship." And I eventually picked up the phone to Bristol, which is where, I can't think of the plumbing name now, Natural England are based. And I said, "Could I have a visit, please?" "Mr. Hamley, oh, no, we know where all the good spots are, Mr. Hamley." "No, I don't think so." So anyway, truth of it was I pestered them, and then I sent them an email, and they eventually sent a gentleman up from Truro to have a look around, to see what I was doing. I'd already provided soil samples, etc., for him. And he came to me and we looked around, and he said, Philip, I've got to go back to the office and we'll let you know about this in due course. And I was absolutely chuffed when the telephone rang again the following morning. Philip, we'll be delighted to offer you a full stewardship, higher level stewardship all over the farm, which is wonderful. It's a 10-year agreement, so I've only got a year or two to run now. Now, I possibly suspect I'm overdoing it, and I think now that perhaps it'd be time to send you back to Matt. But thank you for listening to me. I'll be delighted if at any point I can help you. You're most welcome to come here and look, or I'll talk to you over the telephone. Thank you for watching.
I'll ask you one question before we rejoin.
Yes, sorry.
That's all right. What do you think the most important thing for people have to do if they're planning to restore a meadow? What's the most important thing that you've taken away from your work?
There's only one thing that they need, because anyone can do it. They need to be enthusiastic and, secondly, passionate. Because if you want to do something badly in life, you will do it. You'll find the way, etc. You'll organise it. You'll do it. And that's what I've done. And there's so much pleasure to be had, not only for ourselves, my wife and I, but I literally have visitors here who walk around and come back to me crying with pleasure from what they've seen. It's wonderful. Wonderful for all of us.
Thank you very much for that. That's great. So just to wrap up, there's lots of places where people can get more information. I mean, you guys are so lucky down here as well. You've got an amazing resource in the More Meadows group, and the resources and information and videos and support on there. And obviously there's a group, there's an online forum where people can ask questions as well. And clearly over the next year, Plantlife is going to be helping to support and work with some of the meadow owners. And again, we're going to be sort of able to help support other people that aren't directly involved in the project. So you know, it's great that there's all this kind of activity happening as well. There's a few other places that are worth looking at. Plantlife has got a really useful YouTube channel with some really useful content around meadows and meadow restoration. I think Donna's going to be sharing links for some of these places with everybody in the next day or two, everybody that's signed up on this call. The other website that's worth checking out if you're after more detailed sort of technical guidance is the Magnificent Meadows website, and that has a whole load of guidance and kind of goes into quite a lot more detail about what I've just talked about over the last sort of half hour or so. The other thing just to mention is that Plantlife is a charity, so all our work is funded through our members primarily. So we're obviously always after new members, but also we're obviously trying to spread the word as well as widely as possible. So we're quite active on social media. So if that's your thing, we'd love to hear from you, and obviously we'd really like people to share the stuff that we're putting out on social media. And again, if you want to find out more about Plantlife, our website is up on the screen there. So that's everything from us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Matt and Philip. That was fantastic talk, and I learned a lot. So thank you very much. I just want to say to Philip, just very quickly, because unfortunately the screen, well, all our screens froze for a few moments when you were just discussing about the process of creating a meadow, that it's not something that happens overnight. And I just thought if you could just say a few words about that.
Well, if you're going to do a meadow, you've got to have a lot of patience, because it's not a quick fix. You can't do it overnight. It takes 4 or 5 years to really get it established. But one of the nicer things about that then is that each year now we're astounded. We're finding a new plant here every year virtually that's just arrived because conditions are right for it. It's Mother Nature at work again, you see. So it's very heartening.
Thanks. I'm just looking at the questions. Right, the first one, this is going to be to Matt. Do meadows need the same management every year? What if you miss a hay cut?
Okay, that's a really good question, and it's obviously something that people do worry about. I guess it depends on at what stage you are in the restoration. I mean, in an ideal world, you would try and cut your meadow fairly annually if you can. But I wouldn't. If you miss the odd year, it's not the end of the world, I would say. I mean, I think fundamentally more management is better than no management. In an ideal world, but of course if you do leave some of your meadow uncut, it's going to be really good for some of the insects and the invertebrates as well, and that's something we didn't get a chance to touch on, the fact that if you don't necessarily have to cut all your meadow every single year. You could cut a part of it and leave a part of it and then cut that the following year, and you're getting a bit more structure there for some of the other wildlife that obviously benefits from a wildflower meadow. So yeah, but I mean ideally yes, but if you miss the odd year, not the end of the world.
Okay, thank you. And another, I think this is probably for you, Matt, as well. Sean Aubrey wonders if it's possible to create a meadow in an orchard.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, typically, again, it depends a little bit on how the orchard's set up. And if it's an old orchard with trees that are very far spaced, I mean, most wildflowers, meadow wildflowers particularly, need sunlight. So they need a fairly open site that's not too shaded. And in traditional orchards, generally the trees are quite well spaced and there's quite a lot of grass. Yeah. So it is possible. It does come with some challenges because it's not always that easy to graze an orchard, unless the trees are all protected from grazing livestock. And also just the fact you've got trees in it sometimes makes it more challenging to take a hay cut potentially, or to remove the grass. Because ultimately, to make this meadow system work and to make those wildflowers do really well, you need to keep that grass suppressed at those different times of year, and you need the grass needs to be removed at some point during the year. But it is absolutely possible. You can cut it with machinery, maybe small machinery, maybe garden machinery. So depending on your setup, it is possible. Just makes it a little bit more complicated, I guess, because you've got to work around the trees.
Yeah, and just out of interest, I mean, because I've got an orchard near it, I think of it as a spring meadow there, because actually the leaves falling from the trees every year obviously add to the fertility as well. So it makes it a little bit harder around the trees themselves. Yeah,
but we would say that any patch of grass can be made better for wildflowers. It doesn't have to necessarily be the most species rich, but of course any wildflowers are better than no wildflowers. So it's all on a continuum, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Sarah Jameson asks how to manage creeping thistle and docks prior to restoring a meadow. So I don't know whether that could be
maybe
Philip.
I might ask Philip to come in on that one.
Well, I'll tell you now, I've had the lot. Nettles, not too badly. I've had quite a few docks and quite a few creeping thistle. But about 12, 15 years ago, when I started in earnest, I did have to spot spray. And in the last 3 or 4 years, that's fizzled out to virtually nothing. I don't try and kill everyone every time, because you won't be able to do that. But as the fertility of your land drops down, they cease to become a nuisance. Lots of times now, I hardly ever see any new docks coming up, mainly, of course, because the ground's not being disturbed. I do get a bit of creeping thistle occasionally, but only in certain places. But I got to tell you that in the early years, I spent a lot of time walking around with a knapsack sprayer. That's the simplest thing to do, and you can squirt. I did a count one day. I think I can do something like a knapsack full in about an hour. And you will have, by that time, you'll have hit about 3,500 docks or whatever you're spraying. One point I would make, there are 2 sprays that you can use ideally for this. One which everyone will know, which is Roundup, glyphosate, and that'll do a good job. The only thing against that is that when you spray Roundup, like any other spray, you're bound to get some overspray around it, and then 2 or 3 weeks later you've got a great big circle. Your dock has been killed, but you've got a great big circle of ground around the plant. Now there's a bonus to that, because that's the ideal place to drop a few seeds then, but that makes it that you've got to be pretty diligent to keep on top of all these things, so that they don't come back. The alternative to that is something called Graze On, which is available in a little litre can. It's quite expensive, but you only need a fraction in your sprayer. It's a very small amount. A litre will last you for, well, it'll depend how many docks you've got, won't it, or thistles. But it's very effective. And where Roundup, it can take a week, 10 days, a fortnight, depending on the weather, time of the year, to show any effect. Graze On will show overnight. You will see the leaves just collapse overnight. So it's very quick. So if you wanted to go out again the next day, it's easy to identify the ones that you may have missed. So, but they're both very effective, and you're only putting on the tiniest squirt in selected places. I have no pangs of guilt about it, because I'm very much against spraying, because when it's farming, it's blanket spraying. Like, if you've got to get out of the tractor seat, it won't be done. But so walking around with a knapsack sprayer, it can be a bit laborious, but an hour and so here and there, you'll soon get on top of them. It can easily be done. I've done 40 acres like that. But not everywhere is full. You'll get them in patches. So I would definitely say have a go at that. It'll be quite all right.
And I would say as well, just to add to that, I mean, Philip's, we would obviously always encourage people to use spray cautiously and, very, very selectively. And obviously, if you've got the right equipment and you can do it effectively, and if you're doing it at the right time of year, and particularly when you're doing things like thistles and docks, you want to be doing it in the season when they're most actively growing, because most of these chemicals are taken in through the leaves when the plant is very actively growing. So that's typically in sort of May and June time. That's when the spray will be the most effective. Yeah. And of course, you don't have to use spray if you don't want to. There are other methods, as mechanical digging methods. I showed a sort of hand tool, and it's surprising how many you can do. If you've only got, 4 or 5 acres of meadow, you can walk across that meadow fairly rapidly and dig things out. So it's not. You don't have
it just depends on the numbers and how much root stock the docks have got. If they've been there for years, the root stock can be massive, and if you don't get every bit out, it'll come again. I
mean, that's partly why we sort of talk very much about that, trying to deal with those problems before you then create any disturbance. If you're going to seed, the seeding process that I explained is about disturbing the soil, and you're going to be disturbing the existing seed bank of some of those plants you don't want at the same time. So if you can control them first, that's going to be less of a problem than when you go starting the restoration. So that's the idea. That's the ideal.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I've got small quantities of dock, and I tend to go round. It is small quantities. Is once they've set seed, I go around with a compost bag and deadhead them actually.
Yeah. And that's it. Getting things absolutely before they set seed is a really, really good thing, And if it's on a small meadow, it's not that onerous a job, is it, to walk across the meadow and just pull off the seed? Because some of the seeds will survive for long, long periods of time and still be viable for tens of years in the soil.
Yeah.
So. Thank you. Steve asks, if a meadow is sown with bought-in seed, does it become local provenance seed, or doesn't it matter?
We would always encourage people to try and go through the process that I outlined, which is trying to find a meadow that's in the landscape, in the existing context of where you're living, because obviously the provenance of that seed is very much more local, and particularly if that meadow has been a meadow for a long period of time. I mean, and so we would always explore that first. And now if that isn't an option, that the next sort of best option would be buying a commercial seed mix from a specialist supplier. And there are a handful of specialist suppliers across the country that grow seed on a farm scale. So they actually plant wildflowers and they harvest those wildflowers, and then they make mixes up, and they make mixes suitable for different types of soil. So they're UK provenance. The seed has been grown in the UK, but there are other suppliers online which don't talk anything about the provenance. So you've got absolutely no idea where the seeds come from. And clearly, seed is coming from all over the place. And if you go and buy a packet of seed from Lidl for £1.50, you've got no idea where that seed's coming from. So the provenance of wildflowers is an important thing to consider. And you'll be surprised how different, not in terms of the way they look, but different. The same wildflower in one part of the country will act slightly differently. Maybe it starts growing slightly earlier because it's warmer in the southwest as opposed to somewhere in the north. So a yellow rattle in the southwest will be slightly different than one in the north, just because of the climate and the soil being subtly different. So so it's kind of interesting when you start to explore those things. So we would always, provenance is an important consideration, and we would say if you can't get local, get UK. And because there are specialist suppliers, it's possible to do that.
That's interesting. Do you find that can I ask, when you buy in seed, then actually you might have different flowering times?
Sometimes you do, yeah, and sometimes there's a subtle difference in the way the flower looks because it's grown slightly differently in one part of the country, and it's just kind of there's this kind of this small amount of genetic variance that maybe, as you say, means it flowers a bit earlier because it's adapted to being in a place that's slightly warmer and it's milder or it's colder. So those kind of things, will start to become considerations. And the other concern on a sort of wider sort of environmental concern is that we're just kind of putting generic seed all around the country, and wildflower meadows are subtly different. So a neutral wildflower meadow in the southwest will be subtly different to one in the northeast or the northwest or whatever. There will be a bit of variation in some of the species, might be slightly different, and then we're kind of homogenizing everything if we're just kind of constantly using commercial mixes. So that's an important consideration, that keeping that sort of genetics, the variety there.
Okay.
Purely from an ecological and a conservation point of view, obviously.
Someone has asked if you have any advice on managing an anthill meadow which cannot be mown and sheep aren't keen on the grass come September.
Okay. Typically, fields that have got anthills in them, clearly unlikely to have had machinery in them. It's probably like the picture I showed at the beginning there. You'd have to manage that as a pasture. So it is down to grazing. And ideally you would want to graze kind of probably mid to late summer and then through the autumn and the winter if possible. And sheep will do that, okay, as would cattle. But again, it depends a bit on the soil and how wet it is and how steep it is. Sometimes a mixture of both cattle and sheep can work quite well. And again, it depends on the breed you have as to what they will eat or what they won't eat as well. Some of the more commercial, more modern breeds are a little bit more fussy about what they'll eat, and some of the more primitive breeds and some of the more traditional breeds tend to be a bit more. They're less selective about what they'll eat. But of course, that's not always possible, is it? It's not always possible to find some obscure rare breed sheep to come and eat your meadow. So, but I would say at least having some grazing on at some part of the year, and ideally towards the end of late summer through the autumn, is better than no grazing at all in that situation. Because the other option is you cut, and the only way you could really cut a meadow like that is probably using a scythe or a strimmer or a brush cutter or something like that, which is not. It may be viable, I don't know, but it's a lot of work.
Have you seen any successful meadows in terms of species, a good range of species in meadows that actually aren't livestock but are just cut for hay?
What you mean, that don't get grazing?
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, that's slightly dependent on how fertile the soil is, because obviously certain soils are naturally more fertile. So heavier clay soils tend to be more fertile than lighter, sandier, or more soils. So the lighter the soil, yes. So if the soil is very, very infertile, it always, you're never going to get as much grass growing anyway. So therefore, there's always more gaps. So there's always more room for wildflowers to grow. So, you know, in that context, just taking a hay cut once a year, you'll still get some wildflowers. And even in more fertile sites, you still will get some wildflowers. You just won't get as many, I guess, as if you do the grazing as well. And you'll tend to get the ones that will persist, because there are certain wildflowers that are just more robust and will survive in more grassy environments. If you think about some of our road verges that are just cut and left quite often, there are wildflowers that will survive on those. I mean, yarrow is a good example. That's pretty tough wildflower, will survive most places. Things like the common knapweed, again, is pretty tough as well, and that will often survive and persist on meadows that are just cut and not grazed. So there are more robust wildflowers. You just won't get the variety, I guess. Unless the soil is very, very poor and very, very infertile, then you might. So.
Okay, great. Jacob hadn't asked how floodplain meadows in terms of nutrient inputs. Does the sediment deposit from runoff upstream impede meadow establishment?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, floodplain meadows sort of operate in a slightly different way anyway. And again, it depends on how that floodplain is operating. And obviously that isn't, you don't necessarily know that. And clearly if there's agricultural, intensive agricultural activity somewhere further up in a floodplain, you know, some of that material, that nutrient could end up in the river. And of course, if the river floods, that potentially could end up on your land. I mean, traditionally floodplains obviously acted like that anyway, but I guess it's the artificial fertilizers that end up making those floodplains even more fertile than they might have been historically. Because naturally there would have been nutrients in that water before modern agriculture, and of course that would have come onto the floodplain and made those floodplains very productive from an agricultural point of view. So traditionally floodplain meadows were cut earlier than other hay meadows, partly because they were so productive and they wanted to cut them early. And of course that meant that some of those nutrients were being taken out through that hay meadow management and that early cutting. And so that maintained the balance historically. So you did get wildflowers on those floodplain meadows. But of course, because we've now interfered quite a lot in our floodplains in many places, and because we've also intensified a lot of the agricultural land use around our floodplains, you know, there's always that risk that more nutrients will come onto a floodplain, and then that can sort of upset that balance, that equilibrium.
Okay.
I mean, I was going to say, if you want to find out more specifically about floodplains, there's an organisation called the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, which is linked to the Open University, and they do a lot of specialist work on helping people to restore floodplain meadows, because they are slightly more complicated just by the nature of them being near a river and the fact that they flood, which kind of adds another whole dimension to it. And the way the water moves through the soil adds another dimension to how floodplains operate, and therefore the impact on the wildflowers that might grow in them as well. So they're a little bit more complicated than just a regular hay meadow, but they have some really, really useful information and some very good technical guidance on their website. So the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, if you want to Google that.
Okay, I think we've got time for just a couple more. Sam Wernham asks, if you have any advice for creating a meadow, do you have any advice for creating a meadow on land currently used for arable crops?
Well,
yeah, absolutely. Oh, go on then, Philip, you go.
Well, no, my comment would be that when I bought my land, or the first few fields back in 1980, they had been used for cropping for wheat for several years. So, and then I seeded them with grass seed and clover. And oh my goodness, it's tipping the rain here now. You need that. But, you know, back in those early years, I wasn't trying to make a meadow. But as soon as I gave it the right treatment, let's say, it just happened. And then I put my green hay on those meadows. And I mean, they've done marvelously on it. So it's just time. It will always be time. You can always make a meadow given time. You have to wait for the nutrients to settle down, if not, or find out what plants like your land, and if they, and it's patience, I suppose, patience.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's totally possible to convert a piece of arable land to wildflower meadow. But I guess the same things that I talked through are important. I mean, understanding the soil nutrients, understanding what the pH is, the more fertile that land is, the more challenging it will be initially to get that going. And often if the land is quite fertile, you might deliberately carry on cropping it for a few years without putting any additional nutrients into the land to reduce the fertility of the soil. So that's often done as a way of getting the nutrients down to an acceptable level before you go and then start to introduce your seed. But clearly you're starting with bare soil normally, which sometimes is better, not always, because you may well have quite a lot of residual weeds that have been constantly been killed by the spraying in an arable context, and you may find there's a seed bank of some of the arable weeds that will initially flush when you first sow your wildflowers. So I've seen a meadow restoration that I was involved with on the Downs, on the Chalk in Wiltshire a couple of years ago, which was a nature reserve where they'd been growing a crop. And the first year it was absolutely full of poppies, the whole field. It was about 6 hectares just poppies. And obviously some of those poppies had been in the field when it was an arable crop. And so there must have been an existing seed bank. And of course, what they did was they ploughed the field after they'd taken the crop off. The nutrients were low enough, so they knew it was a good starting point. And then they sowed the wildflowers, which were collected from a nearby nature reserve. And of course, those wildflowers did get established, but along with them, so did some of the other annual plants that would be typical of arable land. So some of those poppies and other plants that you might not want. But over time, as Philip said, and over management over a longer period of time, they've been able to get those perennials, the wildflowers they want, to become more established, and the annuals have started to disappear. So it's just time, really, and it's persistence and it's management that's the key to this.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one final question, which is Monica asked how soil nutrient levels can be decreased most effectively.
Do you want to go for that one, Philip?
Well, it's simply Tom. I know what it's like when we're talking about meadows, and I mean the first thing is some will, as Matt said, some seeds will be up the same autumn, but others maybe 2 or 3 years. Others, I've had seeds that I've put around, and have taken 10 years to come up, and they do surprise you. They just come out of the blue, and you think, well, it was years ago that I do little test pieces. I mean, my meadows are well established, but I still have little packets from the buyers that Matt was referring to up country of other seeds as well, because I just want to see what will happen to them. And I don't spend a fortune. It may only be a $5 worth of seed, but I put them around the meadows as well, and I'd be very surprised. Matt was witness to that last year when he walked around, because he said, "Oh, Philip, you got ladies' bed straw here." And I said, "I put some seeds down years ago, but I've never seen it." And Matt was, and I found another lot after that, Matt. So time.
And I mean, in terms of actually reducing the fertility of the soil, I mean, if you're in an existing grass field, I mean, taking a regular hay cut, because every time you take that hay cut away from the field, you're obviously reducing fertility. And historically, that's how these really species-rich hay meadows came about. As Philip said, it was year after year of taking that crop away, gradually reduces the nutrients, and it is that long-term endeavour, I suppose. But some of the work that's been done trying to look at the best ways and the best approaches to restoration, they've managed to reduce nutrients over 3 years to an acceptable level. So if your phosphorus is over 3, the likelihood is if you take a hay cut for 3 years and then you retest again, you'll probably be within an acceptable range to then start a restoration or a creation. So.
Great.
Say something about what happened to me. And I always tell people, they say, "How long have you been doing this, Philip?" And I used to say, I've been doing it for 20 years or so now. 10 years unwittingly, because I was just not spreading the manure and no fertilizers, not thinking about the plants as much. 10 years unwittingly doing the right thing, and then 10 years in earnest. And that's where I've got to. But
were you going to offer, Philip, that people, you're happy for people to come and have a? I mean, Philip's place is amazing, and it's a great place to go and get a bit of inspiration if you want to see what can be done.
It's not clever. It's not clever, and I always tell people the same thing. But lots of the questions that we have from people, Philip, what do you do about this? How did you do that? And I always tell them the same thing. If you've any doubt about what you should be doing, just think back those 70 or 80 years that I talked about earlier and say, how would they have managed at the time? Don't forget, they didn't have the tractors, they didn't have the sprays, they had labour, but they managed all these things and have done for thousands of years. We've only upset the apple cart since we got clever. Putting things on the land that now, with hindsight, we shouldn't have been doing.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. I think we've now run out of time for any more questions, and I'm sorry there are more questions that we had time to answer, but we'll see whether I can ask Matt to answer some of those. There aren't that many, but in the next couple of days I will be emailing everybody with links, and we can answer some of those questions. I'd just like to say thank you very much to Matt and Philip for a really informative and knowledgeable talk. I really enjoyed it. And just to say to everybody that our next talk is on the 14th of April, and it will be on Burgess. And actually, it's another Plantlife speaker. We've got Kate Petty, who runs the Life on the Verge campaign, and we've got a few other good speakers as well. So we'll send you the link for that in the next couple of days, and hope you can join us for that one as well. And just like to say thank you all for coming, and thank you Tracy and Steve, who are behind the scenes making sure things run smoothly. So thank you, and hope to see you all again at the next talk. Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.